Hi, this is Derek Jordan. Welcome to the World Fusion Show, where we bring you the leading innovators in world fusion music. Today, my guest is Glen Velez, who is a master frame drummer, percussionist, and composer. And Glen has worked with many people over the years, but is also currently playing with one of my very favorite groups, Trio Globo. Welcome, Glen Velez, to the World Fusion Show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So glad that you could join us today. It's really an incredible pleasure to have you and speak to you today. So you grew up in Dallas, Texas, and had a musical family. Your dad was a trumpet player, and your uncle was a professional drummer also. And so you were surrounded by music. And so very early you got into drumming. So tell me a little bit about what that was like growing up.
Well, I used to see my father and his brother play in various bands around Dallas when I was a little kid, and I just was always attracted to the drums. So since my uncle was a drummer, I would kind of stand behind him and just watch what he did. And he always kept his glass of whiskey on his hi-hat. So
Yes.
I was learning the ropes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, it was just, it was a natural progression for him to start giving me some lessons on the drums. And then I just kept on going. That was I started when I was about 7 or
Yeah.
so and started on the drum pad, etc.
Sure. But you also, in high school, you got into vibes, marimba, timpani, you played with the orchestra. So you had a much broader musical background.
Yeah, both my father and my uncle were aware that their kind of worldview was limited in terms of them just playing lounge music or big band music, or everything was around jazz kind of styles. So they understood that I wanted to, have a broader education. So they immediately sent me to the various teachers in Dallas who could teach me about the marimba and about classical music, get me more into reading and timpani, etc.
Yeah, that's so great. Of course, it's wonderful and the experience of playing with an orchestra is very different than with a jazz group, of course.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. You were very inspired by some jazz players, of course, like Coltrane. Who else inspired you?
Well, I was also listening to a lot of pop music, so I loved Jimi Hendrix, and I loved Cream, and those kind of
Yeah.
groups that allowed for more instrumental virtuosity and exploration. So both of those guys I would listen to. I even went to see Jimi Hendrix when he
Oh,
came to
no.
Dallas, and that was in 1966, I think, something like that.
Right. I saw Jimi Hendrix too at Madison Square Garden. I was a huge fan of Jimi Hendrix, but also of the Beatles. And I know you were into the Beatles too. And that's, I think, in some ways, how I got initially interested in world music, world fusion, because of their use of the sitar in Norwegian wood and other explorations that they did. But I think that was important for you also.
Yeah, definitely. It was the first time I became aware of the sound of Indian instruments, and then as soon as I heard them, then I started to explore, LPs that had Ravi Shankar and Ala Raka and
Yeah.
the guys that were initially available here in America.
Right. So you are a frame drummer, but you play a lot of percussion, but frame drum is really your main instrument. And tambourine, so it could have jingles or it might not have jingles. But I wanted you to talk about your attraction to this instrument and the simplicity of the instrument.
Yes, I think that's it took me a while to understand that the size of most frame drums are smaller, because I had been dealing up to that point with drum set and marimbas and timpani, all these very large instruments. And the idea that you could do a lot with something very small was just intriguing to me from the very beginning. And also the idea that it's a very simple instrument. It's just a hoop of some kind of frame with
Yeah.
a skin on it. So, I mean, you can't get much more simple than that. And a lot depends on your own ingenuity. And of course, there's Has a long history, so there are many traditions that have been exploring the possibilities with frame drum for many thousands of years. So there's a lot of availability of the techniques, finding out about the different ways of playing. And of course, when I started, living in New York City. I was able to find teachers from South India, teachers from the Arabic world, teachers from South Italy, Brazil, all these places where tambourine and frame drum were popular. So even though there wasn't a unified way of playing them, there was still all these individualistic styles and techniques.
Oh, yeah. That's great. You know, actually, and one thing I have to say, it sure beats carrying a drum set around everywhere you go, having a frame drum,
Yes.
right? It's a lot more portable. We're going to go to our first video right now, which really demonstrates your really wonderful technique and expression on the solo, as a soloist on the frame drum. Let's just go to that right now and watch this. It's beautiful. All right, and we are back with Glen Velez. That was fantastic, and it's wonderful to see all the articulation that you get with your fingers, and it's obviously a lot of technique there. Must take a lot of practice to learn this.
Yeah, well, I enjoy it so much. It's so satisfying. The sound of the drum really comes back at you, and the vocalizations that I'm doing internally are very helpful to me to organize all the rhythms and all the sounds.
Oh, yes, I'm sure. So you've worked with so many people. We can't really talk about them all, but you did work with Steve Reich back in the 70s, doing mallets with him. I think that was something that was important in your development, right?
Yes, because not only did I enjoy the music, and I think the music is really wonderful, but the other players were very influential because I met two guys who, in that period, in the early '80s, late 70s were already studying Indian music at Wesleyan. So they were the ones that kind of steered me to the teachers that I could get started with it, because I'd always wanted to study it ever since I'd been listening to it in high school, but
Yeah.
I didn't have a chance to, connection with it. So they were the ones that kind of steered me in that direction.
Yeah. So you spent a lot of time in New York in your early years, and you work with a lot of people, but you've also traveled quite a bit to other countries to explore frame drumming. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those travels?
Yeah, the first place I went after studying the various styles, and I knew that I wanted to go to some places and see what it was like in the context of the cultures. So the first place I went was Egypt, and I hooked up with some drummers there, and they took me around to the weddings that were an important part of their gigs. They would
Yeah.
do like 4 or 5 weddings a night,
Yeah,
like
yeah, right.
Saturday night, running from one to another. But there I would see how the techniques and the sounds, how it blended with the instrumental music that was be playing, seeing
Yeah.
how the dance component, how that was so important. And so that kind of taste of what the traditional cultures, how they use the instruments, that was very important. And also seeing some of the different varieties of regional techniques that were going on in Egypt, for one place.
Right, that's great. You also went to Morocco, right?
Yes, Morocco, the same thing. I hooked up with there were some classical music players there that they have a small tambourine called the tar, and it has its own special technique. So, I hung out with them and hung out with just the people in the Marrakesh Square that were playing frame drum, and the snakes were,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
would play and the snakes would wiggle around and stuff. So that was also an important contextual thing that I experienced.
Yeah, I found a lot of wonderful street musicians. Really surprisingly wonderful. Yeah,
Yeah.
in my travels. Okay, so you have some new CDs coming out. One is your second CD with the Master of Frame Drums that's
Yes.
coming out soon,
Yes.
but also a new CD with Trio Globo, which is one of my favorite groups. And that one also features your wife, Laura Kotler. So we are going to go to a Trio Globo video next. But do you want to say something about Trio Globo?
Yes, well, this was, of course, this is Howard Levy and Eugene Friesen and myself playing percussion. And the beauty of that group is just that we're not only, very into our individual instruments, but we're also into expanding what's possible on the instrument. And all of us are really devoted to that idea that each of these instruments, the frame drum, the cello, and the harmonica, have many, many capabilities that are still waiting to be explored, and we're eager to do that. So we have that connection, and we also have the connection, like we were talking about before. We all grew up around the same time in the 60s, and when Indian music and even some Middle Eastern music came to be available in the United States. So we all turned on to that at that point, and then have kept up our interest and our devotion to learning more about that.
Yeah, well, I have to say, in full disclosure, we've had Howard Levy on the show and also Eugene Friesen.
Yes.
So now I've got you, so we've got all three. I'm pretty psyched that we have all three of you guys.
Great.
It's really great. So let's go to this video now, which is a beautiful tune by Trio Globo. back with Glen Velez. Hey, Glen, that's just fabulous. I love that tune. It's such a gorgeous piece. Now, you've done a lot of special collaborations, and I just want to talk about some, if you would. You've worked with Coleman Barks, who is a Rumi translator and scholar, and you've played with him a bunch. Also, with dancers in Santa Fe and stuff. I want to talk about some of those unusual collaborations.
Yes, well, the work with Coleman Barks has been really wonderful. He's a very unusual and musical reciter of these poems that he's translated. So Rumi is, has a lot of subject matter that's very interesting, not only about spirituality, but about spirituality and music and how they connect. And Coleman is from Georgia, so he has this fantastic Georgia Southern accent, and he's reciting this Persian poetry, and he does it in a very unique way that's very musical in the sense that he will repeat certain phrases and respond to what's going on in the musical accompaniment, which is all improvised. We're just improvising underneath him. And so there's this give and take that's unusual in the context of accompanying someone who's speaking. So that's really satisfying. And then Zuleika is a dancer that also participates in that experience. So there's movement, there's music, and there's the recitation. And I think it comes out in a very full way as an experience for the audience.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. I'd love to see some of that. I'd love to go to our next video, which is with a duo with you and your wife, Loire Kotler. She does a very dynamic vocal rhythmic expression. And do you want to set that up for the audience, please?
Yes, she does what is called konakol or solkatu, and this is South Indian rhythm language. And this is used by the drummers and the dancers and the musicians of South India to organize their rhythm and have a vocal expression of what the rhythm is. So it's a very extensive training that goes into this, and of course it's a lifelong study. And we're focused on how do we use this in the context of the original music that we do, and also insert it into various kinds of Western music. So that's what this is all about.
All right, let's check this video right now.
Tongu tatadin, dina tongu tatadin. Tongu tatadin, dina tongu tatadin. Tongu tatadin, dina tongu tatadin. Tongu tatadin, talanga dari giri dari giri dari talanga dari giri dari giri dari tun. Talanga dari giri dari giri dari tun. Talanga dari giri dari giri dari. Din tadin 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 tatakiri dik tadin dik tadin 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 tatakiri dik dong giridum tadin 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 tatakiri dik tadin dik tadin tadin tatakiri dik tadin dik tadin tadin tatakiri dik dong giridum tadin tadin tatakiri dik dong giridum tatakiri dik tadin dik tatakiri dik dong giridum tatakiri dik tadin dik tatakiri dik dong giridum tatakiri dik tadin dik tatakiri dik tadin dik ta. Tongu tatadimi tongu tongu tatadimi tongu tatadimi tongu tadit tadina tongu tatadimi tongu tadit tadina tongu tatadim tadit tongi dik dari giri dik thakri dik dari giri dik dari giri thakri dik dari giri dik 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 dari giri dik dari giri dik dik dari giri dik tongi dik dari giri dik dari giri tongi dik dari giri tongi dik dari giri dik dari giri tongi dik dari giri dik tongi dik dari giri dik tadit tongi dik dari giri dik thakri dik dari giri dik talang dinna dinna din thakri dik dari giri dik tadit tongi dik dari giri dik thakri dik dari giri dik talang dinna dinna din thakri dik dari giri dik tadit tongi dik dari giri dik thakri dik dari giri dik talang din thakri dik dari giri dik talang din thakri dik dari giri dik talang dinna din talang dinna din talang dinna takutinna din takutinna din takutinna din giri dik dari giri dari giri dari giri takutinna din takutinna din takutinna din ta giri dik dari giri ta giri dik dari giri ta giri dik dari giri takutinna din takutinna din takutinna din ta di giri dik dari giri ta di giri dik dari giri ta di giri dik dari giri tong giri dik dari giri ta tong giri dik dari giri tong giri dik dari giri ta tong giri dik dari giri ta tong giri dik dari giri
All right, hey, that is just fabulous, really great stuff. I'm sure that's going to be a ear-opening experience for our audience. I'm so glad you could share that.
Yes.
Glen Velez, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today on the show. It's just been great to have you share your music and your love of drumming and rhythm with our audience.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, great. And now we're going to go to the part of the show where we play together. And this is just a fun part, really a great challenge for me always. I'm sure I'm going to be greatly challenged by working with you. But hey, that's why we do this, right? Anyway, lots of fun. Thanks again. All right. Okay, hey, this is Derek Jordan. Thank you for joining us today on the World Fusion Show. It's been great to have you. We have lots more great musicians coming up. And please, subscribe to us on YouTube, go to our Facebook page, like us, share the episodes that you love with your friends, and help us spread world fusion music far and wide. And remember, think globally, listen locally, and support independent music.
Thank you.